This video is going to talk about fiscal policy and specifically then how fiscal policy affects the aggregate demand curve. So to do this, we'll start with the basic expression that describes aggregate demand, and that's C plus I plus G. Well, there's also got NX in there that you should remember, but I've dropped the NX part because we're going to focus on these components here. So fiscal policy refers to the spending and taxation policy of government, and particularly tied to using these powers with the idea of trying to manipulate the economy, and particularly most commonly to say, if the economy is in a recession, is it possible for the government through its spending and taxation decisions to help stimulate the economy? Now, we've seen that in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, a recession is a short-run equilibrium where output is less than full employment GDP. So the key to overcoming that could be to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So that's what we're going to talk about here, and we'll see how it is that we're going to end up doing that. So if we want to shift the aggregate demand curve, so we've drawn one here, if we want to shift it to the right, we have to have an increase in aggregate demand. This is the basic structure of aggregate demand, or what the components of it that add up to aggregate demand. So we have to think about how government might be able to increase these components of aggregate demand. And they could try and do it through government spending, transfers, and then taxes. Now, I make the distinction between spending and transfers because this G here, if you go back to chapter 6, when we defined gross domestic product, the G in the C plus I plus G plus NX is government purchases of goods and services. So this would be government spending on things like roads or building post offices or the military. The government, things when the government is going to be spending money to actually get command over goods and services. So since G is a part of C plus I plus G, well, then if we increase government spending on these items directly, well, it directly increases one of the components of aggregate demand here, and that will increase aggregate demand. So we would see a shift to the right of aggregate demand like that, a shift to the right of aggregate demand. So that's what we'd have to do. So increase in G, that's going to work directly, and it works directly through the G in here. So the next thing would be government transfers. Now, government transfers would be programs where government takes money and then sends it to another person who then would spend that money. Now, if you look at government spending or some of the recent federal government spending bills, transfer programs get counted in government spending as we measure it there. So if you look at Congress recently passed a $2 trillion COVID spending bill. So, okay, any transfers count in that spending. But for our purposes, that's not the G. When government is undertaking some kind of a transfer program, then what it's doing is it's taking revenue and giving it to most likely households who would then go ahead and spend it. So transfer spending would not affect the G, but it would boost the C. Now, it would boost the C in that it would give more income to households. If they go out and spend it, then that would translate into an increase in spending. So transfers could work for this. They are contingent on whether people, the households, when they receive that income, actually go out and spend it. So in the different rounds of COVID stimulus checks that were sent to households, if they were going to stimulate the economy, they would do it through the C component, the consumption component, but it would only have that effect if if people actually went out and spent that money. If they save it, then it's not increasing C and it's not boosting aggregate demand. So transfer payments could work, but they're a little bit questionable. So I'll put a question here, a check by, but also a question mark in that it is contingent on something, and that's the behavior of households. Then the third thing that government could do would be taxes. Now, taxes taxes would not be affecting G, but what it could end up doing is affect either C or I, depending on which taxes would be cut. They're going to end up having a similar effect, but we don't, for our purposes, we don't have to worry or be so fine in a distinction in terms of which taxes are being cut. But a reduction in taxes would get paid by either households or businesses. If it's a reduction in taxes on businesses, then businesses would have more to spend, and then they would likely be able to engage in more investment spending. So if businesses have more money at their disposal, they might end up investing and boosting the I component. And then taxes, if they're on households, then they could end up increasing household income, which, given to the same proviso I just said about transfer spending, if households get this, if households get the reduced taxes, so they get to keep more of their income, then they could go out and spend it. And if they do, then that would boost aggregate demand through this C component. So, but again, there's a little bit of question whether the money goes to businesses or households. It's not necessarily going to be spent. If it is, it will increase aggregate demand through either the C or I components. Now, there's a complication about this fiscal policy here. Well, suppose government's going to increase spending. And then suppose they're going to balance their budget. If they're going to balance their budget, then they'll be increasing spending, so that increases the G component. And then so increasing spending meaning spending on goods and services. So that increases the G component. But what if they increase taxes? So when you add taxes here, I'll put like a tax cut has this effect. If you're going to have more government spending, and you're going to instead, then you're going to at the same time raise taxes. You don't have a tax cut. A tax cut could shift aggregate demand to the right. You'd have a tax increase. So here, what we'd be having is an increase in government spending, but then with increased taxes, households would say have less income to spend. And if they have less income to spend, then their consumption could go down. So if you were going to balance, government spending with an increase in taxes, the problem is you have two offsetting effects here. You would have G go up, C go down, and they would to some extent offset each other. The same thing would be if you tried to cut taxes and at the same time cut spending. If you were going to cut taxes, but you say like, oh, we're going to balance the government's budget. If you cut taxes, then you'd have, instead of the decline here, you get an increase perhaps in spending. Again, depending on whether households go out and actually spend that money or not. But then you get a decrease in government spending if at the same time you have to cut spending to balance out that tax cut. So if you cut taxes or increase spending and then balance the budget, well, if you increase spending, you've got to raise taxes, and that's going to offset the effect of the increase in G. If you cut taxes to try to increase aggregate demand, but at the same time you cut government spending, that's going to offset the effect of the tax cut. So when we talk about fiscal policy in either government spending or tax cuts, there's almost certainly has to be, we have to end up with more borrowing. We're going to have to do something that's going to worsen the government's budget deficit. We're going to either spend and not increase taxes, or we're going to cut taxes and we're not going to cut spending. And remember, the government's budget, to give the budget, it's revenues minus spending. So when spending goes up and revenues, which would come from taxes, don't go up, spending goes up, revenues don't go up, that's going to be an increase in the deficit. If you cut revenues, if you cut taxes, that will reduce revenues, but if you don't reduce spending, then again, that deficit is going to get worse. So increasing the deficit is really what you'd have to have for expansionary fiscal policy. You're going to have to, one mechanism or another, increase spending with no increased taxes, or cut taxes without cutting spending, either way, you're going to make the deficit worse. So when we talk about fiscal policy, what it basically comes down to this a stimulative fiscal policy to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right has to involve increased deficit spending.